The case emerged in 1998 in the state of Oregon, when child psychologist Helen Ward, recognized for her work with early childhood memory distortions, received a family seeking explanations for a set of unusual behaviors. The child, Emily Collins, aged 6, had been pronouncing phrases that didn't fit into her daily life, and which, according to her mother, seemed to belong to someone who had lived decades earlier. The most intriguing part was that the statements referred to experiences that could be associated with the life of Marilyn Monroe, who died in 1962. Emily's mother, Karen Collins, reported that everything started unexpectedly. Emily, during a common breakfast, commented that she didn't want to repeat the scene so many times as they asked. On another occasion, while looking at a family photo album, she said she was used to much brighter lights than those. Nothing in the family's routine justified such a discourse. The Collinses led a quiet life with no proximity to the art world, no collections of old films, and no habit of consuming celebrity material. In the first session, Helen sought to maintain complete neutrality, recording every phrase the child said, as directed by the protocol developed by Stevenson, a pioneer in the systematic research of spontaneous memories in children. When asked how she knew certain things, Emily simply replied, "I remember, but it's not from here." The clarity and confidence of the phrase immediately caught attention. Over the course of the following meetings, new elements emerged. Emily repeatedly mentioned that people expected too much of her, that the clothes shined brighter than she wanted, and that she needed to smile even when she was tired. None of this matched the child's present life. She attended a small school, faced no family pressures, and lived in a stable environment. Karen added another relevant detail. Her daughter had woken up one night asking if the newspapers were still talking about her. The mother, not understanding what it was about, tried to ask more, but the girl only said, "I appeared in them many times." Another episode occurred when Emily observed a folded newspaper on the table and commented that some people wrote things that weren't true. With the accumulation of these records, Helen decided to document the case in detail, faithfully following Stevenson's methodology, record the literal phrases, avoid any kind of suggestion, and later look for possible correspondences with verifiable historical facts. The psychologist understood that many children's reports can be fantasies, but the growing set of consistent and emotionally specific details demanded increased attention. From that point on, the Collins case began to follow a different path from a common psychological consultation. There were statements that seemed to align with real information about Marilyn Monroe's trajectory, even though this implied no conclusion. The objective was to understand if Emily was reproducing content from some unidentified external source, or if, as observed in various studies conducted by Stevenson, these were spontaneous fragments of a memory that didn't belong to this life. With the first sessions concluded, Helen Ward decided to deepen the documentation of the case following the systematic method described by Stevenson. Every phrase from Emily was now recorded with the date, circumstance, and literal form, avoiding any premature interpretation. The goal was to observe patterns, recurrences, and the possible existence of verifiable details that could be compared with real historical records. One of the first elements that caught attention arose when Emily commented, without any stimulus from the psychologist, "I didn't like my real name. It was too heavy." The phrase, "in isolation," could be seen as common imagination. However, when analyzed parallel to Marilyn Monroe's history, born as Norma Jean Mortensen, a name she expressed discomfort with in various public accounts, it became a point worthy of clinical observation. Helen noted the statement without reacting, as the method dictates, but the content was marked as potentially compatible. In another session, while drawing freely, Emily stated that she had much lighter hair before, but it wasn't natural. The observation, made with childlike naturalness, coincided with the historical fact that Marilyn adopted platinum blonde hair at the studio's request. The psychologist remained silent, only noting the behavior and the context in which it emerged, aware that any intervention could influence the statements. As the weeks passed, new phrases emerged that reinforced the impression that the child was describing situations that didn't belong to her current reality. On a quiet afternoon, while listening to sounds in the consultation room hallway, Emily commented, "They were always walking back and forth waiting for me to repeat the scene." The word scene, although common, was not part of the girl's everyday vocabulary, as she had no contact with audiovisual productions. The family also reported episodes that occurred at home. One night, after a louder noise came from the living room, Emily woke up startled and asked, "Are they going to come in even if I say I'm tired?" Karen Collins tried to comfort her, but the child did not explain who they were. There was no history of intrusions, threats, or situations that could justify such a phrase. Another important data point arose in a particularly calm session. When Helen simply asked how her day had been, Emily replied, "I had a man who helped me with my lines, but he got sad with me when I cried." The psychologist recorded the phrase literally and moved on without delving deeper, to avoid any suggestion. Later, the content would be compared with accounts about professionals who worked with Marilyn Monroe during filming, known for dealing with her emotional difficulties and instability on set. Throughout this period, Helen noted that Emily did not show enthusiasm when talking about the possible memories. She didn't display joy, fear, or theatricality. The phrases were spoken objectively, almost automatically, as if describing something routine. This absence of dramatics was an element frequently noted by Stevenson in cases considered genuine spontaneous memories. Each week, the set of notes grew, and the psychologist began to identify that the pattern of the statements did not seem to be the result of childhood fantasy. What presented itself was an articulated set of emotional fragments, linked by recurring themes such as pressure, exhaustion, repetition, and surveillance. Elements that could correspond to some extent to Marilyn Monroe's real life. With increasingly concrete data, the next phase would be to compare Emily's records with available historical documents, always with caution and methodological rigor. With months of accumulated notes, Helen Ward and two associated researchers from the University of Oregon began the systematic comparison stage, following the methodological rigor of Ian Stevenson. The objective was to analyze whether Emily's statements presented clear correspondences with verifiable facts from Marilyn Monroe's life, always distinguishing common coincidence from a significant detail. The first group of phrases analyzed involved recurrent statements about premature death. Emily at different times had said, "I left too soon," and "It wasn't supposed to happen that way." Although phrases of this type can be generic, the team considered the fact that they were repeated with a similar emotional structure to be relevant, aligning with the public knowledge that Marilyn died at 36, considered a premature age. Another set of information concerned the feeling of constant observation. Emily mentioned several times that there were people watching even when she didn't want them to. The researchers compared this statement with historical testimonies about the intense pressure from photographers, studio surveillance, and the frequent presence of assistants and professionals around Marilyn. This parallel was recorded as compatible, but not conclusive. Statements about residents also began to attract attention. Emily mentioned that she had a house that was never really hers, and that she didn't sleep well in a room where she was supposed to rest. Upon checking biographical records, the team identified that Marilyn had successive changes of residence throughout her childhood and adult life, including temporary homes, rented houses, and hotels. The content was classified as a significant detail due to the emotional specificity of the child's phrase. During a particularly precise session, Emily referenced a medicine I took when I was sad and added, "It was to make me sleep." Helen noted the statement without questioning, as the protocol dictates. In the comparison phase, This segment coincided with official documents about Marilyn's use of sedatives and barbiturates, especially during periods of greater instability. For the first time, the researchers classified a correspondence as strongly specific. Another relevant episode occurred when Emily spontaneously asked Helen, "Are people still arguing about whether I did that alone?" The phrase, written without any additional interpretation, was later analyzed in relation to the fact that the circumstances of Marilyn Monroe's death remain a topic of debate even today. The team considered the statement unusual for a child without media access, recording it as highly suggestive. Throughout the analysis, the researchers applied Stevenson's central principle: no correspondence should be interpreted in isolation. The value was in the whole set. Emily presented repetitive patterns, an absence of contradiction, and details that, although not publicly unknown, were out of reach for a child without prior exposure. Another aspect observed was the complete absence of fantastical elements. Emily did not describe magical scenarios, imaginary figures, or incoherent stories. The content maintained emotional consistency, always related to themes such as exhaustion, demands, surveillance, and lack of autonomy, all present in Marilyn's real trajectory. As the cross-referencing of information advanced, the case became increasingly difficult to explain by conventional means. There were no identifiable sources of learning, nor behavior indicative of deliberate invention. The team concluded this stage with the certainty that there was enough material to continue the in-depth investigation, now focusing on the psychological patterns and the stability of the memories reported by the child. With the advancement of the investigation, Helen Ward initiated the analysis of the internal patterns present in Emily's statements. This stage followed exactly the type of approach that Ian Stevenson employed in his studies. Identify repetition without induction, verify internal coherence, and observe whether the statements followed the typical behavior of spontaneous memories as opposed to imaginative constructions. The first aspect observed was emotional consistency. Emily did not speak of the possible memories with enthusiasm, fear, or an intention to impress. Her phrases emerged simply, almost automatically, in contexts where there were no stimuli related to the theme. During a session where the psychologist only asked about homework, the child replied, "They wanted me to continue even when I no longer had the strength." The phrase was recorded without comment, and Emily changed the subject seconds later, as if nothing special mattered. Another highlighted point was the absence of childhood fantasy. Emily did not create stories, did not mention non-existent characters, did not describe imaginary scenarios, nor did she present constructions typical of childhood creativity. All statements had an adult emotional structure, repeating ideas of demands, exhaustion, and lack of privacy. This attracted attention because children her age usually mix real elements with fantasy. Emily, conversely, demonstrated a stable and sober pattern. The researchers also analyzed the fragmentation of the recollections, a characteristic frequently mentioned in Stevenson's studies. Emily never offered a linear narrative. Her phrases emerged disconnected, like fragments of intense moments. On a rainy afternoon, upon hearing footsteps in the hallway, she commented, "They kept going back and forth waiting for me to be ready." In another session, upon seeing Helen's bag, she said, "I had one that never matched what they wanted me to wear." None of this had any relation to her current life. The family was equally assessed. The Collinses maintained a simple routine in Portland, with predictable schedules, regular school participation, and an absence of domestic conflicts. The researchers visited the house, observed available books, toys, and materials, and found no object that could allude to Marilyn Monroe or the cinematographic era of the 50s. Emily did not have access to the internet, did not watch television by parental choice, and did not frequent environments where information about the actress was discussed. Another important element was the temporal stability of the statements. Stevenson emphasized that genuine, spontaneous memories tend to repeat over months, with few variations. In Emily's case, themes such as pressure, scene repetition, intense lights, surveillance, and tiredness emerged with constancy and without contradictions. The child never added absurd details or ones incompatible with previous statements. Furthermore, the team ruled out alternative clinical explanations. Emily showed no signs of dissociative disorders, delusions, severe anxiety, familial influences, or any behavior that indicated conscious manipulation. There were no secondary gains. The girl did not seek attention by mentioning the memories. On the contrary, she seemed indifferent to the fact that her phrases attracted the adult's attention. In one of the most striking sessions, Emily said, while observing the window, "I only realized I couldn't decide my life when it was already too late." The phrase, although simple, carried a strong emotional load. However, when gently asked what she meant, she only replied, "I don't know. I just remember." The joint analysis confirmed that the case presented several characteristics compatible with the literature established by Ian Stevenson. Even so, no definitive conclusion was possible. What existed, up to that moment, was a set of rare patterns, and increasingly difficult to explain. With all the statements recorded and the memory patterns already identified, Helen Ward and the involved researchers initiated the most meticulous stage of the investigation, comparing each fragment reported by Emily with documented facts from Marilyn Monroe's trajectory. The procedure rigorously followed the logic applied by Ian Stevenson, who advocated that only specific correspondences, without an apparent source of learning, should be considered relevant. The first set of data examined involved emotional conditions and work routines. Emily had repeatedly mentioned that she needed to repeat scenes non-stop, that people expected her to smile even when tired, and that she seemed to be watched all the time. Upon comparing these statements with historical records, researchers found clear equivalences with testimonies from directors, screenwriters, and production assistants from the 1950s, who reported the pressure exerted on Marilyn during filming, in addition to the repetitive demands imposed by the studios. Another significant point was the child's statement about shiny clothes she didn't want to wear. This segment coincided with costume records used by the actress in iconic productions, including the use of flashy dresses intended to reinforce her public image. The detail was not popularly unknown, but the relevant issue was that Emily had no access to television, magazines, or any media that could provide this information. The analysis deepened when Emily mentioned a man who always held a piece of paper and kept saying she could do better. The comment was compared with accounts about professionals who worked directly with Marilyn, many of whom were known for demanding rigid performance during filming. Although it was not possible to associate the phrase with a specific individual, the relational structure described by the girl fit precisely with the film production environment of the time. The investigation also considered phrases involving medication. Emily commented that she took something to sleep, but that she didn't want to. Researchers cross-referenced this statement with medical documents and old interviews that described the actress's increasing use of sedatives, especially during periods of strong emotional instability. This point was considered one of the most specific correspondences between the child's account and verifiable historical data. Another fragment that drew attention was when Emily asked, completely spontaneously, "Are people still arguing about whether I did that alone?" The phrase, written literally in Helen's report, showed a strong parallel with the persistent public controversy surrounding the circumstances of Marilyn Monroe's death. The team recorded this segment as extremely unlikely to arise without external stimulus. Additionally, the researchers observed that many correspondences were not only in the content of the phrases, but also in their emotional load. Emily spoke of pressure, surveillance, tiredness, dependence on others, and a feeling of loss of autonomy, elements that appear repeatedly in biographies and testimonies about the actress's life. The child, however, showed no interest in fame, cinema, or celebrities. Her statements were neutral, almost devoid of emotion, as if she were merely recovering fragments of a distant experience. The team concluded this stage by reinforcing that the objective was not to validate metaphysical interpretations, but to document unusual coincidences between the spontaneous accounts and real history. What made the case relevant was not the hypothesis of reincarnation itself, but the consistency of the set. Absence of a source of learning, high specificity of details, and temporal stability of the statements. With the correspondences recorded, it remained to evaluate the psychological impact of those memories on the child's life and define how to conduct the following months without reinforcing any identity associated with a previous life, a precaution frequently emphasized in Ian Stevenson's studies. In the final stage of the investigation, Helen Ward focused on evaluating how the memories reported by Emily influenced her psychological development and what the most appropriate way would be to conclude the study without reinforcing a possible identification of the child with the figure of Marilyn Monroe. This approach directly reflected the recommendations made by Ian Stevenson in his works: document without inducing, observe without suggesting, and preserve the child's well-being above any hypothesis. The first aspect evaluated was Emily's overall emotional state. The girl appeared serene, with no signs of anxiety related to the reported memories. She spoke of them without enthusiasm, but also without fear. The phrases emerged spontaneously in ordinary moments, and when finished, the child herself showed no interest in delving deeper. This indicated that the statements were not associated with a need for attention or dramatization, a crucial point for ruling out secondary gains. The second element observed was the temporal persistence of the information. Over months of follow-up, Emily maintained strict coherence in the themes she addressed: pressure, surveillance, tiredness, task repetition, discomfort with appearance, and dependence on medication. These contents did not vary erratically, nor did they acquire new elements that suggested increasing fantasy. On the contrary, the memories remained stable, fragmented, and emotionally aligned with each other, exactly as described in many cases documented by Stevenson. The third pillar of the conclusion involved reviewing all the historical correspondences found. Among them were the rejection of the real name, the discomfort with shiny clothes, the reference to intense lights, the repetition of scenes, the constant presence of people watching, the use of sedatives, and the indirect mention of the controversy surrounding her own death. Although none of these phrases, in isolation, could be considered extraordinary, the set formed a rare pattern, especially because Emily had no access to sources that could explain this information. Based on these observations, Helen drafted a technical report for internal record at the University of Oregon. The document concluded that the case presented characteristics compatible with the phenomenon of spontaneous memories investigated by Ian Stevenson, although without claiming to prove any continuity of consciousness between lives. The emphasis remained on rigorous documentation and objective analysis of the statements. Following Stevenson's recommendation, Helen advised the parents not to reinforce the memories mentioned by the child. She asked them to avoid repeating questions, commenting on possible relations with Marilyn Monroe, or creating expectations around the phenomenon. The intention was to prevent Emily from forming an identity based on something that seemed to belong to the psychological past and not the present. Over the following months, Karen reported that the phrases began to decrease. By the age of 8, Emily hardly ever mentioned themes associated with the previous memories. According to her mother, it seemed that the memories lost strength until they disappeared. This gradual decline is something frequently described in Stevenson's studies. Spontaneous memories tend to weaken as the child progresses into more complex cognitive phases. The Collins case remained restricted to the academic community and was never disclosed to the public. The involved researchers considered the material valuable due to the consistency of the statements, the absence of learning sources, and the clarity of the parallels with historical records. However, none of them interpreted the case as definitive proof of reincarnation. The study fulfilled the role of recording a rare and still little understood phenomenon. The final reflection left in the report echoed a question present in Stevenson's work. When a child accurately describes experiences they have not lived, to what extent are we facing an emotional echo? And to what extent are we facing something that exceeds the known limit of human memory?